The 2024 Women's Prize Longlist is the best longlist I have ever read. Not just from the Women's Prize, but of every book prize ever. We need to start a petition, send it to the Women's Prize, that these judges need to be the judges every year. In this video, I'm going to review all 16 books on the long list. I'm going to tell you what books I think have a good chance to win, who I think will win, and I'm going to tell you my personal shortlist. And let me tell you, half of this long list I've given 5 stars to. It's spectacular. I'm going to go through the books from worst to best. Now, when I read books for a book prize, I do try not to DNF books. Normally, I can be very trigger happy with my DNFs. I really encourage you all, if a book isn't working for you, dump it like it's a bad lover and you have self-esteem. You're beautiful and you deserve good books. Stop kissing toads and hope that they turn into princes, and start kicking the occasional prince in the dick. That said, I fully intended to make out with any toads on this long list like I was a stoner at a frat party trying to find some higher form of existence. But even then, at some point, I need to just accept that I'm giving Kermit a tongue bath and that things have gotten a little bit weird and it's best that I stop, which is my weird way of saying that I did DNF 2 books on this year's long list. My Abins Hangman. I DNF'd this book before the long list was announced. When I saw it on the long list, I thought, go on, it's been longlisted. Somebody's bought that frog a shiny new outfit. And I've realised 2 things. Clothes do not make us the frog, and this metaphor is silly because I'm married. Hangman is the story of a man who returns home to an unnamed African country after he has been exiled for over 2 decades, only to find it changed. He is greeted by his cousin, who calls him brother, who instead of taking him to his real brother, who is potentially seriously ill, this brother-cousin person takes him back to his house and offers him a clearly dodgy investment opportunity. Meanwhile, there's some large bird in his bathroom, and the fish and chicken meal this man got on his flight into the country have gone off in his baggage. So he offers them to the large bird. Work that one out, Sigmund. This is a book with even less focus than this video, which is why I'm going to make the obvious leap and bring up Tom Bombadil. Tom Bombadil, for those of you who don't know, is a character from Lord of the Rings who divides opinions. Love him or hate him, when they made Lord of the Rings the movie, they didn't include him. And that's because, whether he's good or bad, he's completely unnecessary to the plot. Binyam has included her very own Tom Bombadil in this novel, the protagonist, who is so passive it's almost like he isn't there. I know there's a very good reason for that, but every interaction with him was like a conversation with ChatGPT, where you say something really idiotic and see if ChatGPT accepts your truth. Here's an example. Instead of fingers, I have bananas on the end of my hand. Can you give me some suggesting for touch typing?
I'm sorry, but I have no specific advice for touch typing with bananas instead of fingers. Touch typing relies heavily on muscle memory and finger dexterity, which would likely be very different when using bananas. My recommendation would be to experiment and find what works best for you. You may need to adapt the standard finger positioning and typing techniques to accommodate the unique shape and movement capabilities of bananas. Some potential suggestions could include trying to use the knuckle or widest part of the banana to press the keys, developing a new finger to key mapping that works with the banana shape, focusing on larger, more sweeping motions rather than fine finger movements using both hands and coordination to type, rather than individual fingers. I wish you the best of luck in your banana-based typing endeavors.
Thank you, ChatGPT. I think we can all agree that you would make a terrible protagonist in a character-focused novel, but easily on par with Binyam's protagonist. When it comes to character development, character creation, or characters in general, this book is abysmally poor. And then there's the advice other characters provide. Is this intended to be insightful or thought-provoking? She told me that politicians pretend to have personalities, but the idiosyncrasies were just traits they developed in order to get elected. To most voters, it was less important for a candidate to have a coherent ideology than it was for them to have a dog, a second home, or a familiar sense of humour. I mean, it's not wrong, but I wouldn't call it insightful so much as the bleeding obvious. And these observations really fell flat without a character to help humanize them. This is a very poor imitation of a Kafka novel. That said, if you completely disagree with my opinion on this book, and if you haven't yet read Franz Kafka's The Trial, you might enjoy that one. While Hangman was a very poor book in my opinion, I wasn't surprised to see it on the long list. I cannot say the same about The Beautiful Blue World. Follow the Woman's Prize for long enough and you'll know that the long list throws up something very literary and something very commercial and a whole bunch of stuff in between on every long list. Look, I'm not a big fan of saying literary and commercial are opposites. In my opinion, a good book should be both. That is usually what I enjoy about the Woman's Prize every year. So it really isn't a big surprise to me that the two books I didn't enjoy from this year's long list fail in the complete opposite way. A boring chore of a literary fiction novel and a mind-numbing sci-fi novel. And I'm sorry to say, but this isn't even a good sci-fi novel. Nothing happens. The characters are flat. It is without themes and it is completely forgettable. I DNF'd this one at just after the halfway point, but I cannot provide you with a good or insightful review because nothing happens to talk about. It's a cozy sci-fi about first contact and a future with virtual reality, which I guess is questioning authenticity and our experience in this world or of this world. There is an alien rock star who seems to not be particularly talented, but uses some mind power to make people have a great time. And he has hired a secret service-like human to look after him, and she is our protagonist. I kind of feel sorry for this book. It has been done a disservice by being put on the long list because the audience of this book, they either don't read Women's Prize long-listed books, or if they do, they're not looking for books like this on the long list. It's just bad branding to include a book like this. It's a bit like seeing a James Patterson book on the Booker Prize. I also feel sorry for this book because it is the third novel in a series. And I'm a believer that if a book is nominated for a prize and it is part of a series, it needs to stand on its own feet. Now, if these characters have already been created, if they have been developed in a previous book, then I'm really selling this book short. But that does mean that this book doesn't stand on its own. I recommend this book to readers who thought, I like Piranesi, but it could use a strong dose of lithium. It really does boggle my mind to see how those two books joined these other 14 books. It's not just about quality. Yes, I think they're poor books, but they really don't fit. It's like going to a vegan restaurant that also serves T-bone steak. It just doesn't fit. And if you're a steak fan, I can't imagine you're excited about having one from a vegan restaurant. It doesn't imply expertise in cooking T-bone steaks. Let's move on to the 14 good books. Restless Dolly Maunder by Kate Grenville. This is an unremarkable cradle-to-grave story of a woman's life. Born in the late 19th century in outback New South Wales, Dolly has had her life dictated to her by the men in it. Wanting to be a teacher, her father yells, "No daughter of mine will have to work for a living." Dolly is also born into a generation of change. Education was not compulsory for her older siblings, but for Dolly, it was compulsory until the age of 14. One thing Grenville is particularly good at doing is showing us how the roles of women changed throughout Dolly's life. Dolly is our author, Kate Grenville's real-life grandmother. Grenville herself is now around the age Dolly was when she passed away. This to me seemed like a gimmick before I started to read this book, but reading it, there is a legacy. Dolly struggles in part to build a better life for her daughter Nance, and in turn, when Nance was working, she helped look after young Catherine, or Kate as she is known today. We see how Dolly struggles against the patriarchy. We see how things are different for her daughter, how there's more opportunity for her, but that she is still struggling against the patriarchy. And then we know that Nance's daughter is a celebrated author and a previous winner of the Woman's Prize. It does make you wonder, what will life be like for the grandchildren of the youngest authors on our prize? This book is a tribute to the ordinary women who have come before and the battles they fought to pave the way for the next generation. Dolly's life is not what I would call typical, but it isn't too far from normal. I'm not sure Grenville even realised when she wrote this book, but her grandmother has the most typical ADHD behaviour I have ever seen. Unhappy with her lot in life, she convinces her husband to buy a business, and then another business, and another business, and business after business. This is where the word restless comes from. It is the "I have defeated that, what is next" ADHD trait. The novelty trait. And I guess it's a very powerful reflection on Grenville's skill to build a character, because at no point was a diagnosis made, at no point is this hinted at. And as I've already said, I believe Grenville is completely unaware that she wrote a neural atypical character. But rather, I think that she was simply true to what she knew about Dolly. And as a result, the signs become obvious. Dolly, however, is an incredibly unlikable character. She is cold and distant, failing to empathise with other characters. She refuses to change her mind and pushes her children to do things they don't want to do. This makes it very hard to support her, to care about her. And I think Grenville has intentionally shied away from justifying Dolly's actions, telling us Dolly's rationale, and making us understand this flaw, and the failure to do that really makes it a struggle to empathise with her. And as too does her pretty bloody good life for the times. I feel like asking, why should I care about this rich, entitled, unfeeling woman? The reader is not provided with motivation, and maybe it is enough that she is a woman fighting against the patriarchy of her time, but she dictates her children's schools and her daughter's career. She becomes a manifestation of the patriarchy to the next generation. This is not the kind of book with tension running through it. It isn't trying to be thought-provoking either. It is just a tribute to the women of yesteryear. Dolly Maunder could be any woman. That is sweet, that's nice, it's reverential to an era of women who for the most part have been erased or completely diminished into a few lines. It is quite a successful book at what it is trying to do, but it is also a book that really lacks the ambition to get away with anything less than being perfect. And as a reader, there isn't much to take away from this book. It is merely an adequate novel. River East, River West. This is a novel with two converging timelines. 2007 Shanghai with Elva, the 14-year-old daughter of an expat American mother Sloane and an unknown Chinese man. Elva longs for the American things, but living in China, she is unaware of her privilege. Elva's mum announced that she is engaged to Lu Fang, their wealthy landlord. Our earlier timeline starts in 1985. Lu Fang is a young married man working as a clerk in a shipping yard when he meets a young blonde American woman called Sloane. Now, I'm sure you can do the maths here. Elva is 14. Sloane and Lu Fang met 22 years earlier. But you still wonder, could Lu Fang be her father? Elva is at the age 14 or 15, depending on what part of the book you're reading, where she is pushing against the structures in her life, like a lot of teenagers do. These structures are Sloane and China. The healthy mother-daughter relationship that the two have had to this date is put to the test, not just by teenage rebellion too, but by Sloane's new relationship. Elva identifies more with the Americanness of her identity, wishing to go to the US school in Shanghai rather than her Chinese school. Sloane, on the other hand, at one point says, "I'm glad to have broken free of the US of A." The reversal of attitudes here is very interesting. It is not just Sloane's desire to be away from her country of birth, but also in Elva's desire to go there and fit in. Is Elva a Westerner trying to travel to the West, or an Easterner trying to travel to the West? This brings up this halfway identity that Elva has, this mixing of cultures and privileges. Ava is picked on for being an outsider by her Chinese classmates, but she doesn't exactly fit in with the US students she sees either. Upwardly mobile Lu Fang treats Elva very well, but his lack of English excludes him from certain situations. Elva becomes embarrassed for this man, who at times becomes relegated to comic relief, much to the detriment of this novel, I think, as well. There is very much a grass is always greener, everybody wants to fit in elsewhere, but who who really fits in theme to this novel. There is also a massive side plot towards the later part of the novel that is pretty feminist, and I won't spoil it for those of you who haven't read this novel. But if you have, surely you know what I'm talking about. If we replace feminist roles with racial roles, we actually get quite a similar interpretation to what is going on. And then we must ask, is the exploitation in this situation happening because of the genders of the characters or because of the race of the characters? And I think the answer is very clearly both. When we are analysing this text for the racial implications of what has been said, Elva manages to fill in for both American and Chinese characters, depending on the situation. Being hated for her privilege, being outcast for her race, and never remembering to repay the Chinese housekeeper for the money she borrowed for a taxi. So why is this book so early in the list? I mean, it's a little bit because of the strengths of the novels to come, but this book is also either too long or too short. I've not really discussed Lu Fang's timeline here at all, and that's because I don't think it works with Elva's timeline. It could have been a really good standalone novel with a few more pages and a bit more fleshing out, but the major themes in Lu Fang's timeline are depression, bad parenting, and I guess you can look at this as a fitting in with family versus a fitting in with country and draw comparisons to that. But I do feel that most of the themes and discussions from Lu Fang's timeline do not add to Elva's timeline. We needed more time with Lu Fang and his family for his section to really work. It's like somebody has made you a nice cup of tea but hasn't left the tea bag in for long enough. So at the end of this novel, I'm kind of like, well, give me a little bit more, or get rid of one of the timelines. This is still a really impressive debut novel, and it is very clear that the author has a lot of talent. I really enjoyed the way that this novel challenged both the rule of the Chinese Communist Party and the ideals of the American dream, pointing out that neither are what we are told that they are. I'm pretty sure we could say the same about the rule or the ideology of a lot of countries too. The fish rots from the head, as they say. I think if you are curious as to what Celeste Ng may have written if she set a book in China instead of the US, then this might be a good book for you to try. Western Lane by Chetna Maroo. This is one of these books that I just keep on having to review. People love it, people hate it. It's been shortlisted for the Booker Prize last year, and now it's been longlisted for the Women's Prize this year. If you haven't yet read it, you have probably heard the word squash, verified that it was indeed bad midden mixed with cocaine, and thought, nah, I'm good. Which is a gross myth categorization. Squash is much more like indoor tennis mixed with murder. Western Lane is a really emotionally driven novel that is exploring familial bonds and grief. Gopti's mother has recently died and her father is struggling to cope, and the two turn to squash as a distraction from their grief. Gopti focuses on winning a tournament and her father on a brutal training regime. This is a coming-of-age narrative, and not just of Gopti but of her sisters, who in the absence of their mother all have to grow up before their time, helping their struggling father. We witness Gopi develop a crush on her fellow squash prodigy Ged, and their relationships allows us to explore relationships between British people of Indian descent and white British people. Whether you like this book or not comes down to if you think the emotional descriptions work, whether you can relate or empathize with the child and the father, which I think is one of the reasons it gets such a range of reactions, because if you can empathize with the characters, it works, and if you can't, it doesn't. I think the other reason that this is getting such mixed reactions is that it has a real Claire Keegan feel to it. But it's not quite up to Keegan's incredibly high standard. And I think some of you will maybe feel ripped off that it never quite got there, while others of you will think anything close to Keegan sounds pretty fantastic. 8 Lives of a Century-Old Trickster, Mirinae, a middle-aged, recently divorced woman who works in a nursing home helping residents write their memoir, meets Mrs. Mook, and she gets one hell of an interesting story. This is essentially the framing story of what is a collection of interconnected short stories about the life of a woman who is almost 100, and it is based on Mirinae's own great auntie. Along the way, we see the Japanese occupation of Korea during World War II, the Korean War. We learn of her experiences as a North Korean spy and how she defected to South Korea, her abusive father, the story of her husband, and not only do we get this portrait of a really cool woman who has lived a very interesting life, but we get a description of the changing nature of Korea over the last almost 100 years. Look, we've reached the point in this video where they're all good books. And there are some really strong points in this novel. The discussion of comfort women and the realities they face is always terrifying, and this is another example where it is done really well. I enjoyed the inclusion of her eating dirt in her father's story. I loved the way she tricked her husband, and I loved his reaction when he realised. And those good things overshadow what I am about to say next. But there are reasons I don't rate this book higher. There is a lack of depth. The pace is too fast, which means that the meaningful discussion of themes are limited, providing a lack of meat. The framing story would have been better if it was broken up and put in between all the stories rather than just at the beginning and the end. And then as this book went on, the stories sort of combined. Later stories became a bit indistinct, and it would have been a much stronger novel if we could have, say, 5 stories, but the same number of pages. Keep the story when she was a child, when she was a wife, when she was a spy, when she was a comfort woman, and the framing story when she is in a nursing home, and give them a bit more depth. And this is just a much, much better book. Still overall a very good book. And I know that this is really cliche, but I think if you like Pachinko by Min Jin Lee, then this is a good book for you. Brotherless Knight, V.V. Ganeshananthan. I think my opinion of this book compared to others is relatively low, and I still think it's one hell of a good book. It's also a really well marketed novel. Set in Jaffna, Sri Lanka, 1981, 16-year-old Sashi wants to become a doctor. Over the next decade, she will become caught up with the Tamil Tigers and the civil war that engulfed Sri Lanka at that time. If that sounds like the sort of book that you like, then pick it up. I won't say I guarantee you will love this book, but I guarantee you won't dislike this book. I guarantee you will not have a bad experience. There are very, very few 3-star ratings and below of this book. And this is the first book I'm reviewing on the long list that I think has a very healthy chance of winning the prize. Sashi and her mother watch on as her 4 brothers leave to join the Tamil Tigers. Also, their friend and neighbour Kay leaves, who rises up the ranks of the Tigers. Elements of Kay's life are based on Talipan. I'm going to put some information up on the screen about Talipan in a moment. I'll only leave it up for about 3 or 4 seconds, so make sure you pause it. It does contain spoilers, but I think this adds to the book for those of you who have read it, so look away now if you don't want to be spoiled. You can look again. One of the things I love about historical fiction novels is when I learn things. Now, I know about the Tamil Tigers. I knew there was a horrible civil war in Sri Lanka, but I was confused about the role of India in that war. I didn't understand the complexities of the war, which seemed almost as complex as the various factions at play in the Troubles. There were certain events that I didn't know about, and this was just a very educational read. I also loved the point of view of Sashi. I loved how she was essentially on one side of the civil war and also very critical of that side, very critical of their tactics. Even though she was lucky enough to be educated and working as a doctor, she gives us insight into how the war affects everyday people. I'm really not into war novels that compliment or criticize the general or the soldiers. Rather, I like war novels that tell me how the lives of the people were impacted by that war, and I very much value that about this book. One of the ways that we see how this war affects people is the dream Sashi has of becoming a doctor and her realization of how that dream is impacted by the horrible conflict. It's no surprise to see a few really strong books from Sri Lanka about civil war. I've already compared it to the Troubles in Ireland. And as far as talking about literature, I think everybody can see how that conflict mixed with a history of great authors has created so many wonderful books. And I can definitely see the same sort of thing starting to happen here in Sri Lanka. This complex and horrible war mixed with people who are very proud of their literature. In 10 years' time, this may be one of the first novels we talk about as a Sri Lankan renaissance, maybe. And it's nice that it's a bit feminist too. On the negative side, I think the pacing of this novel was just a little off. It's not too bad. I think novels like this should vary their pacing. Slowing down the pacing is a very good way to highlight a situation and let the impact of what has been written really settle in. You could see a battle scene being very high-paced, and then when a character dies, the freezing of the pacing. The pacing really does need to be appropriate for the situation, and that's where this book has failed. It slows down the pacing at the wrong points in the novel. The character creation suffers from this. The only character I felt I understood was Sashi. It wouldn't have taken much detail to get her mother, her teacher, and Kay to all come alive. And that really does hold back what is otherwise an incredible book. I think this is a good one if you liked Independence by Chitra Bandri Divakaruni, The Maiden by Kate Foster. I think when the Longlist was announced, we all looked at this one and said, I'm not too sure about this. And I have to say, this was quite a pleasant surprise. I am very glad the Women's Prize included this on the Longlist. Credit to Kate Foster. This is just doing so many of the basics right. It has a plot you just want to keep reading. It is incredibly compelling. It has characters I found so easy to understand, to like, and to root for. And this book is doing something the Women's Prize always finds a book to reward every year. It takes a historical story and it's reviewing it through a female or feminist lens. And I'm really glad that it's not a Greek myth retelling this time, but it's the story of Lady Christian Nemo, a lady who was executed for the murder of Jamie Forrester. And here's a little bit of detail I found about her online, written well before this book was published. She was a great deal younger than himself, and a niece to his first wife. This near relationship greatly increased the scandal, which was aggravated by Lord Forrester having always professed to be a religious man and a rigid Presbyterian. Mrs. Nemo, besides being a very beautiful woman, was of a violent and impulsive nature. She was believed always to carry a sword under her petticoat, and so was not a person to be treated lightly, especially by those who reflected what blood ran in her veins. Mrs. Bedford, who had murdered her husband a few years before, being her cousin. She was also related to the unhappy Lady Warriston, who suffered death for the same crime in the year 1600. Lord Forrester's passion for her appeared to have cooled, and, shutting his eyes to possible conquests, he permitted himself to speak more than lightly of her. And this came to her ears and seized her with fury. She went once to his castle at Corstafine. A violent altercation took place between them. In the midst of it, she snatched the sword from his side and ran him through the body and killed him. She confessed her crime, but pleaded that Lord Forrester, being ferocious and intoxicated with drink, had drawn his sword, that to save herself she had snatched it from him, and that in the struggle he had fallen upon it and so killed himself. In spite of this defence, sentence of death was passed upon her. She was beheaded at Market Cross on the 12th of November 1679. At her execution she appeared dressed in deep mourning with a long veil, which before laying her head on the block she took off, replacing it with a white taffeta hood. She met her fate with great courage. It was said that at the time, in spite of his professed Presbyterianism, a dispensary from the Pope to marry Mrs. Nemo was found among Lord Forrester's papers, and that his delay in using it had caused her fury. As you can see, she was far from being thought of as a hero or a martyr. While that's a great story, it is the fictitious character of Violet who steals the show, a working girl who Jamie Forrester takes on as his paid mistress, before or maybe not before he begins the courting of Christine, depending on how you view that. But certainly before his wife passed away. Foster has added this detail to the story, and she's taken other liberties where they added to the novel, prioritising the outcome rather than the truth. And I love that. If I wanted to read the truth, I can read a Wikipedia page. But when I pick up a book, I want a good book, and I got one. I really enjoyed the double perspectives that Christine and Violet's narrative add to the book. It adds contrast and it allows us to learn more about Jamie, how he manipulates the women in his life, and of course it adds tension to the plot. Similarly, I love how we have an upper class and a lower class woman in these situations. Additionally, the maid Oriana was a fantastic character too. I did enjoy the title not being a reference to Christine Nemo, but rather to a type of guillotine, because I'm a good socialist and I enjoy a guillotine reference. I think plot-wise this is pretty much the perfect book. The narrative style where the chapters alternate between the lead up to the murder and the events after the murder really worked too. Theme-wise, we're getting a broad view of the roles women had available to them in the late 17th century. It is obviously a feminist novel and it is obviously a historical curiosity. Everything is done really well, but there really isn't a lot of meat on the bones here. This book is not going to change anybody's life or make them feel seen. It's not going to change minds or inspire conversation. It is a very good, entertaining book. It does have some things to ponder on, but it is doing exactly what it intends to do, and it is doing it very well. It's not my normal kind of book, but I really do enjoy this sort of book as something a little bit different between other books, especially when it is done this well. I think you would really like this book if you enjoyed something like Diane Setterfield's Once Upon a River or even Sarah Waters' Sounds lesbian characters. We're at the halfway point. It is only 5-star books to come. I would really like to take this chance to thank my Patreons for their support. If you would like to get your name on this screen and join me and all these wonderful people in reading and discussing some incredible books, please consider signing up and supporting this channel. Back to the books. In Defense of the Act by Effie Black. You know, it's books like these that make me hesitant to completely catch up on my reviews. In the few weeks since I have finished this book, it has done nothing but climb in my estimation. And this is the second book I am going to flag with a legitimate good chance of winning this prize. Jess studies suicide. She almost advocates for it. There are reasons for this, both scientific and emotionally. She's not some kind of monster. There is trauma and incidents in her life that lead her to think that it's not always a bad thing. It is not a radical opinion she has. I mean, it is a radical opinion, but it's not radical in how she thinks about it. She brings up a case where a father kills himself after murdering his wife and children and thinks how much better their lives would be if the failed attempt a few weeks earlier was successful. She brings up male spiders who, after mating with lady spiders, are killed and eaten to provide nourishment to the mother and their children. Of course, this is not an essay about suicide. This is a story. And Jess brings up her own personal experiences with it. People she has known or not known as well as she thought. Jess is also a lesbian and she has gotten out of a very serious relationship. She is suffering from a lot of trauma, and there is a whole conversation about having children and how that links in with both the theme of suicide and the theme of trauma. I think this is sort of why this novel is a grower too, because Effie Black has really constructed these themes intelligently. If you read enough good books, then there are very few themes you haven't read about. But the combination of themes, how they interact with each other, is often unique and interesting. They of course can't be picked randomly. Obsessive compulsive disorder and the Russia-Ukraine war are probably not the best combination, although they would make interesting books individually. I'm just not too sure what one would add to the other. But all the themes Effie Black discusses in her book really do work together. They really do add to each other and add a different dimension to the conversation. This book also possesses a quirky sense of humour. I love the book club discussion in this novel. We have all been that person that doesn't like that book that everybody else loves. And we've all had that thought of who could not love this book only to find the one person that hates our new favourite. So I feel that the book club was quite cathartic in two directions, especially as it was hinting at a book that, despite it being exactly my kind of novel, I personally think is ever so slightly terrible. Although it really is the obvious choice of a novel to partner with this book for the themes they both possess. Jess feels like an author insert character. Not sure if she was, but I hope so, because she was very easy to like. I also really enjoyed her sister Freya. It is definitely a theme-heavy book, but the characters and the plot are both there and both very well done, and are certainly well better than a pass mark. I'm going to compare this to a not so obvious book, and that is Patricia Lockwood's No One Is Talking About This, and there's a few reasons. The balance of a serious emotional issue with a quirky sense of humour is there in both novels, although Black is definitely more serious than Lockwood, and also manages to stay firmly on planet Earth. But both books find that balance between the emotional and the silly. Both are novels with two parts, starting off a little bit erratic before focusing in on an issue. Although again, I think Lockwood is a little bit more extreme. So I'm not going to say necessarily I recommend this book to fans of No One Is Talking About This, but I recommend this book for fans of the idea of No One Is Talking About This, even if you are critical of the execution. Or maybe especially if you are critical of the execution. Either way, I think both books are wonderful. Soldier Sailor by Claire Kilroy. This is a powerful letter, or an internalized monologue from a mother to her newborn son, written in very beautiful emotional prose. It captures the confusing mess of emotions that motherhood is: exhaustion, love, joy, fear, stress, and even resentment, dislike, and postpartum depression, and the results of a sleep deprivation regime that only the twisted mind of a newborn child could come up with. The fear of what your child might grow up to become, the loss of identity that a newborn child means for a mother, and the growth of a new identity, the dislike of other parents, the dislike of her partner, the stress of living up to another partner who seems somehow perfect in comparison, are all captured, as too is the importance of having someone else to be friends with, another parent going through similar stuff. This is really just one topic done deeply, completely, and fantastically. I could really feel the emotion our mother was feeling. Absolutely fantastic writing. One of the reasons I love to read is to experience new points of view that are not my own. So for me, and anybody who is not a mother, this book offers a fantastic chance to empathize with mothers everywhere. Hence, I love this book. But we do all bring our own experiences to the books we read. Not being a mother myself, I imagine there are two possible experiences for other mothers to have. The experience of being seen, of having your struggles acknowledged by this novel, or the fear of, yeah, I know, I've already done this. Even if you do get that preaching to the converted feel with this book, this is about the book's intention and the personal experience. And what I think nobody can argue with is the stunning execution of this novel, the expert use of stream of consciousness writing, which is a style so many people hate, and I believe that's because it's hard to get right. So often you're reading poor attempts or early attempts, which really is the same thing, and it just gets a bad rap because nobody has done it well, even the people who generally get praised for it. I think Soldier Sailor is an incredible book, but it doesn't make my shortlist. When you read a long list, every now and then you notice two books hitting on very similar themes, two books that share a lot of the same merits, and in this case, there is another incredible book that is also discussing Indigenous culture in the Western world, as well as being a mother, and I'm rewarding that book's extra ambition with what should be, in any other year, the rightful spot of Soldier Sailor on the shortlist. And Then She Fell by Alicia Elliott. Alice is an Indigenous woman of Mohawk origin. She has just given birth to Dawn. She has a white academic husband, Steve, who is learning the Mohawk language. I think this was a really intelligent way to demonstrate privilege, because this is a man who is making an effort to ensure his daughter is connected to the history from her mother's side of the family. He's trying to do the right thing, but at multiple points in this book, he demonstrates that while he understands things academically, he doesn't get the reality. He doesn't want to experience the Indigenous discomfort that Indigenous people have to experience. And as a white man, he kind of doesn't have to. He explains away microaggressions and accidentally invalidates Alice's emotions, feelings, and experiences. The new family moves into a wealthy Toronto neighbourhood. Alice starts to feel detached, not just because they've moved further away from her family and into a neighbourhood where she is the only Indigenous person, but because she is failing to connect with her new daughter. Nights without sleep because Dawn continues to cry push Alice, who is already going through a lot, into a state of mental distress. And then things get a little bit weird. Conversations with a time-travelling cockroach, which is a Kafka reference, by the way, and memories of when she was 13 and Pocahontas began to appear to her and started talking to her. By the way, not the Disney version of Pocahontas. Supernatural references to her before and after begin to emerge, as do links to all the women in her lineage. As Alice's mental health begins to fail, Alicia Elliott expertly ensures that we, the reader, both know what is happening enough to follow the novel, but yet that we struggle to determine what is real and what isn't real. This is really my favourite way to use magical realism, and by favourite I mean it's the only acceptable way, as a demonstration of mental illness or as a combination with Indigenous folklore or spiritual beliefs. Plot-wise, this is an absolute banger of the novel. It has a pacing kind of like rolling a ball down a hill. It is always accelerating. Character-wise, I thought Alice was excellently crafted. The other characters maybe not so much, but they were side characters to this wonderful protagonist. Theme-wise, I adore the intersection of these two themes, the Indigenous identity and the postpartum mental illness, and it's just full of interesting thoughts. At one point, Alice starts to ponder the difference between her and Steve. Thinking about Dawn, she notes that Dawn inherits his intergenerational wealth and her intergenerational trauma. Does that cancel out? I'm not sure it does. I think that you get both good and bad. And for comparison, I'm going to mention one of the best books I have ever read, and that is Freshwater by Akwaeke Emezi, A Trace of Sun by Pam Williams. Sometimes you finish a book and just think, this is the sort of book I like, done really well. For me, this book has the plot, the emotion, the themes, and the character investment I love. This is a book with some big trigger warnings. I recommend looking them up somewhere like Storygraph if you have triggers. I'm not going to tell you what they are, as I'm concerned they could be seen as spoilers as well. Rafe is left behind in Grenada when his mum moves to England to be with her husband. 7 years later, she sends for him. Raf reunites with not just his mother, but with his brother, and he also meets his newborn sister. This is a semi-autobiographical experience. Pam Williams' mother moved from Grenada to the UK when she was pregnant with her, taking her youngest child, a son, and leaving 4 children behind. She sent for 2 children, a brother and a sister, but due to changes in the immigration law, she couldn't send for her oldest 2 children. Williams has removed her sisters from the story, probably to simplify things. Rafe is traumatized by his experience. He resents his sister, who he feels has stolen his time with his mother. He hates the man that she has married, constantly butting heads with him, and he hates his mother for not loving him enough. And we are left to ask, is Rafe asking too much of his mother? Is she loving him in ways that are different to what he needs? Or does she love her other children more than him? This is a book where mental illness is a massive theme, as too is belonging. Belonging not just to a family unit, but to a nation. All 5 members of this family are both British and Grenadian. This struggle for identity is so important. At one point, Raf talks about how cold it is, like he doesn't belong in Britain because he is used to warmer weather. This is an aspect of immigration I've never considered. We think about racism and leaving a support network, clashes of culture, uplifting a life, but surely people who move to Britain from the West Indies all feel cold in comparison. And you can even see this hinted in the name. Does Rafe crave a trace of sun, or is he only getting a trace of sun? Rafe has moved away from his auntie and cousin to live with his nuclear family. He craves his mother, wanting nothing more than to be with her, but he's also pretty happy in Granada. This is a book for people who love reading about relationships. It's not just a mother and son dynamic. There is the relationship between Rafe's parents. Later, Rafe himself finds a partner. There is sibling dynamics. These characters all have friends. Williams has a real talent for creating relationships and for creating characters. And this is the basis for which she weaves a pretty brilliant plot on top of. What I have told you here is not the entire novel. It is really just a starting point. There is so much more that this book is exploring. And if you are participating in Mirinae, this would be a fantastic book for either the illness or the immigration prompt. A fantastic novel that reminds me of Black Cake by Charmaine Wilkerson, a book that I expect to see shortlisted. The Wren by Anne Enright. When the Longlist was announced, I looked at this book and thought, this is the safe pick for the winner. It is a book of fantastic quality written by a heavyweight. Enright is a big name on the Longlist. She has had an amazing career and she's produced another fantastic book. Also, I hear you need to be Irish to win book awards these days. I do think this is definitely a good chance to win, but more than that, this is a book I would be most surprised if it wasn't shortlisted. The Wren is looking at 3 generations of a family. Nell McDara, who never knew her famous poet grandfather Phil McDara, but who at 22 is leaving her mother Carmel's home and is looking to forge her own identity, career and place in the world. Between alternating narratives from Nell and Carmel are poems written by Phil. One of the things I think points out Enright's skill as an author is that she wrote these poems herself, just effortlessly pointing out that, yes, she writes novels, but she could have been a poet too. Phil abandoned his family and Carmel struggles to reconcile Phil McDara, the poet, with her father, the man she hears he is with who she knows him to be. Abandonment and the legacy of abandonment are major themes in this novel. We witness the impact it has on Carmel. Nell's actions make increasing sense as we learn how this trauma her mother has is handed down onto the next generation. As Enright puts it, more than a strand of DNA, but a rope that was thrown from the past, a fat, twisted rope full of blood. A stunningly feminist novel that is also advocating for the closure of class divisions, that criticizes the hypocrisy of a famous poet. You could see Phil's actions repeated in our society time and time again. It is obviously calling out men who pretend to be feminists only to use it as a way of harvesting cookies and continuing to mistreat the women in their lives. But this sort of hypocrisy could also be seen from politicians being concerned about climate change, housing affordability, or insert issue here, and proceeding to pass laws that make those situations worse. We can see it in the gap between the face public figures portray and the reality of themselves. I am really impressed with how Enright captures the voice of all her characters, but particularly Nell. When I was reading this section, this did not feel like the writing of a woman in her early 60s, but rather it felt like it belonged to this new generation of young women writing about their exploitations in their youth. Think Sally Rooney. But the Carmel sections felt much more like an author of her generation was writing. The character voice is so strong and so well done, I could easily be convinced that the different sections were written by different authors. This is quite a literary novel which utilizes some quite complex language and structure, and as a result, if you enjoy the more accessible side of The Woman's Prize, this might not be the best book for you. There are definitely parts of this novel that went over my head, but I think if a book can do that and still be enjoyable, it makes it a very rereadable book, which is a trait I think the judges of a book prize really appreciate, as they will have to reread the winner 3 times. If Anne Enright does win the Woman's Prize, she would be the first author to win the Woman's Prize and the Booker Prize, and that is a very impressive achievement, and I do think she will take some beating. Nightbloom by Peace Adzo Medie. This book is told in 3 parts. First we get Akafora's story, then we get Celeste's story, which includes many of the events in Akafora's section, but we learn new things, which makes what looks like a very simple situation to a much more complex one. At the end of the first 2 parts, the women's stories seem to have gone their separate ways. Both sections start when they're young girls and finish when they're adults and have established their new lives. And the third section pulls everything back together and gives us a stunning resolution. Set in Ghana, this book does a lot. It is essentially 2 coming-of-age novels. It discusses class, corruption, bribery, friendship, sisterhood, trust, adoption, immigration, the struggles to build a better life, the patriarchy, sexual assault, racism, motherhood, women being the breadwinner of the family, nepotism, the school system, the cultural difference between Ghana and the US, trust and revenge. I love the structure of this book because I love it when a book can make me see things from a different way. But what this book has done is show me how easy it is to see things differently. Medie has created an all-round brilliant novel, but it is her use of perspective that makes this book stand out as something special. Akaphora and Selessi were best friends in their childhood, but as they begin to drift apart, Akaphora doesn't know why this has happened and thinks Selessi doesn't want to be friends with her any longer. As Selessi's marks drop, Akaphora focuses more on her studies and eventually moves to America to become a doctor. This book is packed full of themes and conversation starters, making it the ideal book club book. One conversation I really liked was, is Akaphora better off in the US or Ghana? Undoubtedly, there are positives and negatives to both countries, and it lends itself to the conversation of what is important in life. What is it all about? How important are things like happiness, success, family, career, and so on? In Selessi's section, many of the things that Akaphora is contemplating in her life are relevant to Selessi. Although Selessi is still in Ghana, she's still ultimately contemplating her life, its directions, her values, and her happiness. And it is asking the question of, will she put aside her value to ensure the success of her career? Selessi's question is something I think a lot of people might think is simple, just do the right thing. But if you examine your life, tell me, is the chocolate and coffee you buy fair trade? We're talking about a few dollars to prevent slavery. So if your livelihood is on the line, what would you be prepared to turn a blind eye to? And that is the situation Selessi is in. The drawing of Ghanaian society is nothing short of brilliant too. The setting comes across really well, drawing you into the lives of these 2 women and the people around them. The only downside I can see of this book is that it is a little slow to begin with. The first part is building things so the next 2 parts can be absolutely brilliant, and it is completely worth the investment. I still very much enjoyed the first part, but I'm just giving you a gentle warning to give this book a little more time than you normally might. This book draws comparisons to Abi Dari's novel The Girl with the Louding Voice. Ordinary Human Failings by Megan Nolan. 1990s London, a 3-year-old girl has been found murdered with bruising around her neck. The last person to see her was 7-year-old Lucy, belonging to an Irish immigrant family, the Greens, who have a reputation for drinking too much and collecting welfare. Carmel's Lucy's mother is ethereal, damaged, delicate, tiny, and our protagonist. We jump between the timelines where police are investigating the death, trying to determine if Lucy did kill the toddler, and the timeline where Carmel is a teenager in Ireland. There is a tabloid involved and they're paying the Greens hotel bills in return for an interview. I really love how Nolan is taking aims at the media here. How often do we hear a phrase like a free country needs a free media? But the media wants to make money, and what better opportunity than the death of a 3-year-old? You have to wonder why this book is based in the 90s. And when you think of times the media have acted in terrible ways, does the death of Princess Diana not immediately come to mind? But this does pose the question, has the media changed in the 30-odd years since this book was set? This book could have been determining the guilt of Lucy. That would have been a very good story arc, and it will definitely sell books. Nolan, however, is interested in the stigma attached to the family, the assumption of guilt, even from within the Green family. Their place in society identity and the communication around that. And I cannot help but to think that stigma attached to the Greens is in no small part due to the hack work of the tabloid that is now paying their hotel bills, encouraging the alcoholic character in this novel to have a drink in the hope that he will spill the beans. After all, if you're in a Rupert Beelzebub Murdoch media country, I'm sure your media loves to attack both immigrants and doll-bludgers. When you think about everything that went wrong for the Greens to end up in this situation, well, I really think that this quote says it best. Really, who would care about a family like theirs? Theirs were ordinary human failings, tragedy too routine to be of note. The fact that they could be anybody, that this is what trauma and class and bad luck all added up together can create, a lost family. Nobody did care about them before. They just took advantage of them. Throughout this entire book, they are being cheated and pushed to the bottom. And then, of course, there is this very feminine female theme around pregnancy, motherhood, abortion, and the legal issues associated with that. This is an incredible book from an author who I think may be a staple of the literature world for the next 20 or 30 years. We are witnessing the start of a very impressive career here. With her second novel, Nolan's, is demonstrating she has range. I cannot help but to see similarities between this novel and Penance by Eliza Clark. Not just because they're true crime novels that are critical of the media and put society under a lens, but because it is the second novel of an emerging young talented writer who is demonstrating their range and writing something different to their first novel. Enter Ghost. If you give me this incredible long list and ask me to pick a winner, this is a book I'm picking. Although, as I hope I've made very clear, I'm impressed with a number of the books long listed, and I'd be happy if a considerable number of them were the eventual winner. Sonia is a 35-year-old British Palestinian actress living in London who, after the breakup of her marriage, visits her sister in Tel Aviv, where she meets a local theatre group and agrees to perform their version of Hamlet, read in Arabic. What Hammad does is stunningly brilliant. Everything becomes an allegory. All the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players. They have their exits and their entrances, and one man in his time plays many parts. And you see that Shakespeare quote played out in this novel. You can see Hammad blend the world of this play into the world of the West Bank. At one point, she allows actors to keep saying their lines to police who interrupt their rehearsal. The lines are not picked at random from Hamlet. They carry meaning. They are intentionally aggressive and abrasive. You may think that the actors are talking in Arabic, a language that the police do not understand, but I wonder how much that really matters. After all, they're talking Arabic and they're not simply talking, they're acting Shakespeare. The treatment of Palestinians by the Israeli government or police is on display. So too is the general racism and distrust between Israelis and Palestinians. Keep in mind that this will have been written before the current conflict. The everyday fear Palestinians living in Israel have for trying to be visible is tension building. The defiance, rebellion and protest in that act is made very clear. I guess it is natural to want to talk about Israel and Palestine at the moment, and it is a central theme of this novel. But this novel is also about a woman leaving a relationship. She is trying to come to terms with her new identity now that she is single. She is looking to move on with her life, and that story is not neglected or overshadowed in any way by the Palestine story. Hammad really gets the balance correct. The returning home and having to accept change, this is such a big theme in the novels, and it serves to both illustrate the changing landscape of the West Bank, the Israeli creep into more territories, and it serves to question Sonia's identity, to question who she is, the accepting that you are no longer your child self. This novel is very literary, but it's also pretty accessible. I wouldn't say it's the most accessible on the list, but it's not a novel where you should find the brilliance intimidating. It is a novel with layers, and while I'm sure there are plenty of layers in this novel that I didn't get, every layer I got was brilliant. And I think that is a fantastic skill that an author can have to make their book appeal to a wide range of readers. An absolute gem of a novel, and one I think has that rereadability like the Wren, which I think not only makes it my winner, but I think should make it the favourite to win this prize. I would recommend Against the Loveless World by Susan Abdulhala if you enjoyed Enter Ghost. My personal long list is the last 6 books mentioned. I do think that Soldier Sailor and Then She Fell are in a 2-1 situation, and it wouldn't surprise me if the judges didn't agree with my assessment. Honestly, that's a really close call. I've also identified In Defense of the Act and Brotherless Knight as potential winners, and obviously you can't win without first being shortlisted. I think in that situation, Ordinary Human Feelings could drop out for In Defense of the Act, because while I love it to pieces, it is the kind of novel that really will appeal to the people who love it, but maybe won't work quite so well to everybody else. Brotherless Knight might come in, and it's probably in a bit of a 3-2 situation with Nightbloom and A Trace of Sun. I can see A Trace of Sun dropping out for Brotherless Knight, as Brotherless Knight seems to be a very universally popular novel, and I think that Nightbloom had slightly more ambition, although A Trace of Sun certainly doesn't lack that, which means that this is my shortlist, and this is the shortlist that the judges could go for. I think the judges have made things either very hard or very easy for themselves, depending on how you want to look at things. It's going to be very hard to pick those 6 books, but also there are very few cases in where they can actually make a bad choice. If you're new here, please make sure to hit that subscribe button, and I would love to know what you think might make the shortlist in the comments section. Thank you for watching. Bye bye.